Today, we uncover the shocking truth about UK supermarket tinned tomatoes. Remember when a tin of tomatoes actually tasted like a tomato, and not like something that needed rescuing with sugar and puree before it went anywhere near the pasta or curry? For generations, that tin sat at the back of every British cupboard without anyone giving it a second thought. It was the most basic, unglamorous item in the entire weekly shop, sitting quietly next to the beans and the soup, doing its job without any fuss. You grabbed one for a Sunday bolognese, another for a chili, another for a soup on a cold night, and you trusted that what was written on the label matched what was actually inside. Nobody stood in the aisle squinting at the small print on a tin of chopped tomatoes. Why would you? It's tomatoes, some juice, a lid. What could possibly go wrong? Quite a lot, as it turns out. By law, nearly half of what's sitting inside some of these tins doesn't have to be tomato at all. Nearly half the tin can be water and an acidity regulator, and the label is still allowed to call the whole thing chopped tomatoes. One of the country's most trusted supermarkets was named in an investigation that reportedly linked its own supply chain to forced labor on the other side of the world. And the product in question simply stayed on the shelf with no real explanation offered to the millions of people buying it every week. And the food safety watchdog that was finally supposed to ban a hormone-disrupting chemical from the inside of these tins by this summer has just quietly backed out of doing it, leaving Britain out of step with the rest of Europe on the exact same product. And when it comes to food, bad labor practices almost always lead to a bad product on our shelves. On top of all that, prices have crept up hard in the last few years, while portions and quality have quietly slipped. The cheapest tins on the shelf have gone from around 28p to closer to 39p, and the mid-range own-brand tins have jumped from around 40p to nearly 50. That wouldn't sting nearly as much if the tomatoes inside had kept up. Mostly, they haven't. And here's the part that catches people out every single time. The cheaper the tin, the more watery the contents tend to be, which means you end up simmering it down for far longer just to get a sauce that holds together. So the tin that looked like the bargain at the till often ends up costing you more in time, in gas, and in the extra puree and seasoning you throw in to rescue it. So we went through the major chopped tomato brands currently sold across British supermarkets. We checked what's actually printed on the ingredients panel against what the marketing wants you to believe. We looked at where the tomatoes are genuinely grown, not just where the tin happens to be packed. We looked at what's lining the inside of the can and whether that lining is something the manufacturer is willing to confirm or something they'd rather you didn't ask about. And we looked at which of the household names still deserve the trust people have been giving them automatically for decades, and which ones have been quietly coasting on that trust for years, without doing much to earn it. What we found was 9 brands genuinely worth thinking twice about, and a handful that are still absolutely worth putting in your trolley. Some of what's coming up will confirm something you've half suspected for years, every time your sauce has come out thinner and more watery than it should. Some of it will genuinely surprise you, because a couple of names on this list are ones you'd never expect to see here. Before we get into any of that, if you think more people deserve to know exactly what's in their weekly shop, hit that like button and smash the hype button too. It costs you nothing. It takes about 2 seconds, and every single hype pushes this investigation in front of more shoppers who are tired of being taken for granted by companies that assume nobody's actually reading the label. This channel exists because somebody has to actually check, and the more of you who back that with a hype, the more pressure there is on these companies to do better. So let's do that together, right now. And let's get into it. Number 9. Waitrose Essential Chopped Tomatoes. Waitrose sells itself harder on ethics, quality, and doing the right thing than almost any other supermarket in Britain. People choose it specifically because they believe they're buying from a company that cares more and checks harder than its rivals. And that belief is worth something. It's built into the price. So it's worth knowing that Waitrose's own essential tomato puree, sitting just a few shelves along from the chopped tomatoes, was one of the products named in a BBC investigation in December 2024, which reportedly found evidence of tomatoes linked to forced labour in China's Xinjiang region entering the supply chains of several UK supermarkets through Italian processors. Waitrose said its own internal testing found no evidence of this, and the product simply carried on being sold exactly as before. No suspension, no withdrawal, no real explanation offered to the people buying it. For a supermarket that leans this heavily on trust as its entire selling point, that's a genuinely difficult thing to explain away, and the chopped tomatoes sitting on the same shelf aren't offering much of a premium experience either. They come in at around 65% tomato content, with the rest made up of tomato juice and citric acid, the same acidity regulator propping up tins costing less than half the price 2 aisles over. You're not paying for meaningfully more tomato here, you're paying for the name on the shelf edge, and for a story about ethics that the evidence doesn't fully support once you look past the packaging. It's worth remembering the next time the essential range is sitting a little more expensive than an equivalent budget tin purely on the strength of that green and gold label. Number 8. Heinz chopped tomatoes. Heinz is about as recognizable as food branding gets in this country. Multiple generations have grown up trusting that name without ever really questioning it, which is exactly the problem with a brand this size. There's no organic line anywhere in Heinz's UK tin tomato range, and remarkably little transparency about where the tomatoes are actually grown before they reach the tin. The salt content isn't as restrained as you'd hope from something this simple either, and simple is really all a tin of tomatoes needs to be. When a brand this famous is charging a genuine premium purely on recognition, you'd hope the ingredient list would justify it. Instead, you're getting a fairly ordinary formula wearing one of the most expensive labels in the business, resting entirely on the strength of the name rather than what's actually inside the tin. Plenty of long-time shoppers have quietly worked out that the name isn't doing as much heavy lifting as it used to and gone looking elsewhere for their weekly tin without a second thought. It says something that a brand this size hasn't bothered introducing an organic or reduced additive tomato line the way several of its rivals have. When the rest of its own range has spent years chasing exactly that kind of health-conscious shopper, the tomatoes, it seems, were never really the priority. You'd expect a company with this much marketing muscle behind it to treat its most basic product with at least the same care it gives the ketchup, and on the evidence of the tin itself, it simply hasn't. Older shoppers who've been buying Heinz on autopilot for decades, largely because the name feels like a guarantee, may be surprised to learn just how little separates it from the supermarket's own cheapest tin sitting a few feet away at a fraction of the cost. Number 7. Sainsbury's chopped tomatoes. Sainsbury's has always positioned itself a step above the average supermarket, with slightly smarter stores, slightly cleaner branding, and the gentle implication that you're getting something a little more considered for your money. Its chopped tomatoes sit at around 65% tomato content, alongside citric acid, which is barely a meaningful step up from the budget range sitting at the bottom of the very same shelf. There's also an older, less comfortable chapter worth remembering here. Back in 2011, an investigation into Italian tomato supply chains found evidence of exploited migrant labor on farms supplying one of Sainsbury's tomato suppliers at the time, and Sainsbury's own supply chain review acknowledged as much, publicly. To be fair, supermarkets right across the industry have tightened their ethical sourcing standards considerably since then. And that finding is history rather than a current one, but it's a useful reminder that the extra polish on Sainsbury's packaging has never automatically meant a genuinely cleaner supply chain underneath it. And that's still worth bearing in mind the next time you're paying that little bit extra purely on the promise of being a step above everyone else on the same street. The budget tier tins at the very bottom of Sainsbury's own range have, if anything, been more upfront about what they are than the standard chopped tomatoes sitting a shelf above them, pretending to be something more. It's a familiar pattern across this whole category. The closer a brand gets to admitting it's a basic budget product, the more honest the label tends to become, and the more it tries to dress itself up as something premium. The more questions start creeping in around the edges. Number 6. Tesco chopped tomatoes. Tesco is the biggest supermarket in the country, and millions of trolleys go through its tills every single week without anyone questioning the basics sitting quietly among the shopping. Its chopped tomatoes sit right around the legal floor for tomato content, somewhere in the low to mid 60% range, with the rest made up of tomato juice and citric acid. That's not a scandal on its own. Plenty of brands on this list sit at exactly the same point. What's genuinely frustrating is that being the biggest name in British retail hasn't bought you a meaningfully better tin than the smaller, cheaper brands sitting 2 shelves along. You're trusting the size of the company, not the quality of what's actually inside the can. And once you factor in that the pricier tins in independent testing generally need far less cooking down to make a decent sauce, simply because they carry less watery filler to begin with, that gap in real value becomes even harder to justify. Tesco's name buys trust. It doesn't buy you more tomato, and it never really has. For a company that prides itself on knowing exactly what its customers want, it's strange that the humble tin of tomatoes has been left this far behind everything else on the shelf. Even Tesco's own budget range, aimed squarely at shoppers counting every penny, has at least had the decency to skip the plastic lining that the standard range still carries. That's a genuinely useful thing to know if you're shopping there anyway, but it also raises an obvious question. If the cheapest tin on the shelf can manage without it, why can't the standard one sitting right next to it at a noticeably higher price? Number 5. Asda chopped tomatoes. Asda's standard-owned brand chopped tomatoes have picked up a specific and repeated complaint that goes beyond the usual watery tin grumbling you hear about budget brands. Customers have reported a noticeable metallic aftertaste that doesn't disappear no matter how much seasoning you throw at it, alongside sparse thin tomato pieces that break down into almost nothing once they hit the pan. That's not a cooking problem you can fix with more garlic or a heavier hand with the herbs. It's a product problem, and it has a real cost attached to it because the thinner and more acidic a tin tastes straight out of the can, the more you end up compensating for it with extra tomato puree, a pinch of sugar, and another 20 minutes of simmering just to get something that tastes remotely like a proper sauce. Once you add up the extra ingredients and the extra time, that cheap tin quietly stops being cheap at all, and you've effectively paid for a worse product twice over. Asda's own organic tomato puree was also named in that same December investigation mentioned earlier, and Asda said its own checks found no evidence of anything wrong. The tomatoes stayed exactly where they were, and so did the price, and so, it seems, did the aftertaste. There is one small point in Asda's favour worth being fair about. Its most basic budget range skips the plastic tin lining altogether, which puts it ahead of its own standard range on that one specific point, even while it lags behind on almost everything else. Number 4. Morrison's chopped tomatoes. Morrison's has spent years marketing itself as the supermarket that's closer to food, leaning heavily on British farmers, proper produce, and no-nonsense value as practically its whole identity. Its chopped tomatoes don't quite live up to that image once you look closely. The tomato content sits in a similar band to most of the other Big Four supermarkets, with tomato juice and citric acid making up a sizable chunk of what's left. And there's very little on the label to explain where the tomatoes were actually grown before they reached a British shelf. Morrison's own tomato puree line was also named in that same December investigation. And unlike a rival supermarket that suspended supply from the manufacturer in question while it looked into things properly, Morrison said its internal tests found no evidence and simply carried on exactly as normal. For a brand built entirely around the idea of being closer to your food and more accountable than the rest, that's a strange place to quietly draw the line and move on without a word more to say about it. Plenty of shoppers have noticed hard little green stalks turning up in their tins far more often with Morrison's than with almost any other brand on this list, which isn't dangerous. But it isn't exactly the mark of a company paying close attention either. It's a small, fiddly annoyance rather than a serious safety issue, but it's exactly the kind of detail that adds up when you're being asked to trust a brand that built its entire reputation on being closer to the food than anyone else on the high street. Number 3. Lidl chopped tomatoes. Lidl has built a genuinely loyal following on the promise that you're getting supermarket quality without the supermarket price tag, and for a lot of everyday groceries, that promise honestly holds up. It's worth knowing, though, that Lidl operates as part of a much wider international discount group, and in Germany, a different tomato product from the same corporate family was reportedly pulled from certain shelves for a period after supply issues linked to tomatoes traced back to a sanctioned Chinese supplier. That's a German finding about a different product on a different shelf, not a confirmed finding about the UK tin sitting in front of you, and it deserves to be read with exactly that caution rather than treated as proof of anything here. But it's a fair reminder that same company, different country doesn't always mean different standards are being applied everywhere that name appears. On the tin itself, the standard tomato content sits around the usual budget range floor. And while plenty of shoppers genuinely rate Lidl's finely chopped pulper-style range as a decent step up worth the extra pennies, the standard chopped tin remains a fairly ordinary budget product, wearing a slightly trendier label than its rivals down the road. Number 2. Aldi chopped tomatoes. Aldi has taken an enormous share of the British grocery market in a remarkably short space of time, and its tinned tomatoes are one of the quiet pillars underneath that growth. The price is aggressive, consistently undercutting almost everything else on the shelf, and for anyone watching every single penny right now, that's a genuinely attractive prospect. But that price has to come from somewhere, and with Aldi, it comes from a global procurement model built entirely around driving the unit cost down as far as it will possibly go, wherever in the world that particular tomato happens to be grown that season. There's very little supply chain detail published beyond a general country of origin claim on the label, and the tomato content itself sits at the same legal floor you'll find on the cheapest tins from every other supermarket on this list. Aldi will happily tell you it holds its suppliers to its own private label standards. What it won't tell you is a great deal more than that. For a product bought in this volume, week in and week out, by families who trust that logo implicitly, the gap between the trust people place in it and the actual transparency sitting behind it is one of the widest of any brand on this entire shelf. To be fair to Aldi, its budget tins are also among the small group that skip the plastic lining, which is a genuine point in its favour, even if the rest of the label stays quiet about almost everything else. It's a similar story to several of the big four here. The very cheapest tin on the shelf sometimes turns out to be the most honest one, purely because it never tried to promise you anything more than a basic tin of tomatoes in the first place. Number 1. KTC chopped tomatoes. KTC sits in a genuinely awkward spot for a brand that's been on British shelves for decades. It costs more than the cheapest supermarket-owned brands, without offering anything meaningfully better in return for that extra money. The tomato content lands right around 60%, more or less identical to the bargain bin tins sitting a whole shelf below it, and it's one of the very few tins left on the market that still doesn't come with a ring pull lid, meaning you're reaching for a tin opener every single time, while almost every competitor moved on from that years ago. Across repeated taste comparisons, it tends to rank near the bottom of the pile, with reviewers regularly describing it as thin and watery rather than rich, and once it's properly drained, there's often noticeably more liquid left behind than actual tomato. If you're paying more than the absolute cheapest tin on the shelf, you'd reasonably hope for at least one meaningful improvement in exchange for that extra money. With KTC, it's genuinely hard to find one, and that's exactly why it tops this list. So what should actually be going in your trolley instead? The pattern running through every genuinely decent tin on this list is the same one, whatever the price point happens to be. Look for a short ingredient list, ideally just tomatoes and a little salt, with nothing hiding behind the vaguer word juice further down the label. Look for a brand that's willing to tell you where the tomatoes were actually grown, not just where the tin happened to be packed and sealed. And where it matters to you personally, a growing number of brands, budget and premium alike, now openly confirm a BPA-free lining right there on the label, which is worth checking given that Britain's own food safety watchdog was due to finally restrict that chemical this very summer and has just quietly delayed doing so, leaving the UK out of step with rules already coming into force right across the rest of Europe. It's a small thing to check on a label, but it's exactly the kind of small thing that separates a tin that's actually trying from one that's simply along for the ride. None of this means you need to spend a fortune every week just to make a decent spaghetti bolognese. It simply means knowing which few brands are worth the extra handful of pence and which ones are charging you a premium for a name rather than for anything genuinely different inside the tin. First, Mutti Polpa. Mutti is what a lot of people picture the moment you say the words, a proper tin of tomatoes. It's a genuine Italian family company, and the ingredient list backs up the reputation completely. Sitting at close to 99% tomato, with just a touch of salt and nothing else added to bulk it out or mask a thin, watery base, there's no citric acid quietly doing the work that a properly ripe tomato should be doing on its own. It isn't the cheapest tin on this shelf, and it never claims to be. But plenty of long-time buyers who finally made the switch will tell you they simply can't go back to anything else once they've tasted the difference it makes in a proper sauce. It's often held up as the benchmark every other tin on this list is quietly being measured against, whether its makers would admit that or not. The finely chopped pulper version in particular has become something of a cupboard staple for people who cook from scratch regularly, precisely because it does so much of the work for you before the pan even gets hot. Second, Cerio whole plum tomatoes. Where Cerio really earns its place is in the whole plum tins rather than the chopped range, packed almost entirely with tomato and barely anything else, giving you noticeably more actual fruit and far less of the thin, acidic liquid dragging down so many of the tins further up this list. Crush them yourself in the pan with the back of a spoon, and you'll notice a thicker, sweeter result almost immediately, without needing to reduce it down for another 20 minutes just to get there. For anyone who's given up on chopped tomatoes altogether because of how often they turn out watery, this is exactly the kind of tin that makes that decision look like the right one. It costs a little more than the supermarket standard, but nowhere near as much as you'd expect for the difference it makes once it's in the pan. Third, Biona organic chopped tomatoes. Biona keeps things about as clean as this category gets. Organic tomatoes and organic tomato juice, full stop, with no citric acid anywhere on the label and a confirmed BPA-free tin. Certified organic also means no synthetic pesticides anywhere in the growing process, which is more than most of the brands sitting on the avoid list can honestly say for themselves. It's a British family-run business rather than a supermarket giant chasing volume, and it genuinely shows in the ingredient list right down to how little of it there actually is to read. It sits at a genuine premium price, so it isn't necessarily one for the everyday weekly shop, but for a dish where the tomato is doing all the talking, it earns that price. Fourth, Mr. Organic chopped tomatoes. Available through Waitrose and independent health food stores, Mr. Organic offers much the same clean, citric acid-free proposition as Biona at a broadly similar price point. If one isn't sitting on the shelf in front of you on a given week, the other very often will be, and either one is a genuine step up from anything waiting in the standard supermarket aisle. Neither is going to become your everyday tin if you're cooking for a large family on a tight budget, but both are worth keeping a couple of in the cupboard for the dishes where quality actually shows. Fifth, Marks & Spencer chopped Italian tomatoes. M&S doesn't always get the credit it deserves in this category, often written off as too expensive for everyday cooking. In independent blind taste comparisons, though, its chopped tomatoes have repeatedly come out as one of the best all-rounders available anywhere in British supermarkets, beating plenty of brands charging considerably more for the privilege. You're not paying for a heritage story or a volcano printed on the label here. You're simply paying for a tin that quietly does exactly what it says it does every single time without needing an investigation to hold it to account. If you already shop there for the rest of your groceries, there's genuinely no reason to look any further for your tin tomatoes. It's the kind of tin that never makes headlines, precisely because it never gives anyone a reason to write about it. And in a category this crowded with marketing noise, that's a genuinely rare thing to be able to say. So there it is. 9 tins genuinely worth thinking twice about, and 5 that are absolutely worth spending the extra few pence on. Once you make the switch, going back genuinely gets harder, because the difference in the finished sauce is impossible to unsee, and even harder to unnotice once your family starts asking why dinner suddenly tastes better than it used to. It doesn't take a complete overhaul of your weekly shop to notice the difference. It just takes one tin in the right dish to see exactly what all the fuss has been about. Try one of the 5 brands above the next time you're making something where the tomato is genuinely the star of the show, and you'll understand immediately why so many people never go back once they've made the switch. Let us know in the comments which one of these surprised you the most, whether you remember tinned tomatoes tasting noticeably different years ago, and which brand you think we've missed off this list entirely. If you found this useful, hit that like button, smash the hype button, and subscribe, because there's plenty more of this coming very soon, and tell us in the comments what food or product category you want us to dig into next. Until next time, stay informed, stay sharp, and protect your plate.